Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I've really been enjoying the conversations yesterday and look forward to more today. And as I was giving Forrest my title, I was a little nervous about doing this, quite honestly, because I feel like there's a lot of people here at NCAR, including people like Curtis that I was talking with this morning, who also work with stakeholders. And so I decided in part that obviously this is my experiences that I'm trying to share here, and also just kind of infuse it a little bit, since this is an early career focused set of lectures on kind of the progression of my career, sort of in and out of the context of different policy applications. And so I also felt like, since I was using this term stakeholder in the title, I should probably do a little bit of Googling and figure out sort of what are some of the ways that people define stakeholders. And in the process, I found this really nice paper that came out in April 2019 in Fisheries Journal. And so this Runebaum et al. And I really like this figure, probably in part because it puts credible science right at the center and has the biggest circle. But it emphasizes the importance of transparency throughout, as well as communication, building relationships, and also relatability. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those aspects as we move towards the end of the talk. But basically, by relatability, I didn't exactly know what that meant at first. And then in terms of at least the work that I'm doing, I think it means putting things in the right metrics or the right context for the application that you're using the science for. So how do you make the science more relatable to the application? And so that, by and large, the major focus of the talk, because it's been a major focus for me over the last 2 decades, is the ozone smog problem, and kind of working on, I have had the opportunity to work on different aspects of it. And I was in LA last week, and actually the week before, I was at a HACAS meeting, this Health and Air Quality Applied Sciences team that's a NASA program. And as I was driving in from the airport into LA, contributing to the ozone smog problem in my rental car, I realized that there was an opportunity to actually take a picture, and I was thinking about that it was more for showing in courses. But then I realized, hey, why not use it and have a picture that I actually took on my slide today? And I don't know if you can even see, but the buildings are kind of in the haze in the background. And then a tiny bit of the talk will focus on another problem that, in some ways, at least the aspects that I've been working on with respect to ozone are not that dissimilar, which is visibility and thinking about regional haze. And the policy context for that, however, unlike the National Ambient Air Quality Standards under which ozone is regulated, which are really focusing on protecting human health, and secondary standards focus on welfare, which and for the ozone standard also includes vegetation. The visibility is under the regional haze rule, and the context there is to try to get our Class 1 or natural parks and wilderness areas back to natural visibility by 2064. And I've been learning over the last year and a half a lot about the complicated policy context in which that rule is implemented. Okay, so wanted to acknowledge my group. Again, this is the same old photo that I showed you yesterday, but I'm highlighting different folks whose work I'm drawing on today. George Milley, a research assistant. Jean Guo, who's now at Ramble in Nevada, California, working on these kinds of air quality problems. She's a former student. And Xiaomeng Jin, who's a rising 5th-year PhD student, who's been all through her PhD working first with ACAST and then HACAST. And so her PhD has been involved a lot of conversations and collaborations with different stakeholders. And then I also want to acknowledge Eric Hellstrom, who has been a full-time research assistant in my group over the last year, working on regional haze, and Laurel Quinones, who is a summer undergraduate intern. She's a rising senior at Columbia. And one of the things that's really fun about working on policy-relevant questions and the opportunity to work with stakeholder partners is I find that it certainly attracts a lot of students, and so Laurel was very excited to jump in and work on regional haze as well. And then Jake Neymark is also a rising senior at Columbia. He's writing a senior thesis with me, and if we have time, I have a highlight from his work that although that was a concept that he kind of initiated, but then we've kind of tailored it to one that I think will end up potentially being relevant for policy. I'm spending a long time on this slide, but I really want to acknowledge many stakeholder partners that I've had the opportunity to work closely with over the last couple years. And in many ways, particularly those that I have known for longer, these folks have really shaped my career in that they've invited me to meetings. Every now and then they've reached out by email or called and said, hey, I have a question about this. And inevitably I find that as I engage in these conversations, new ideas kind of come to mind, and so more research ends up being generated. So there's a kind of long list of folks at EPA. That was really my first opportunity to engage with stakeholders working on different aspects of setting and implementing air quality policy, largely under the NAAQS, but more recently with regional haze. And then over the years, I've gotten to know folks who are involved in regional air quality management, like Tom Moore and Paul Miller, these are groups that are what are called multi-jurisdictional organizations. They include many states and think about air quality issues from a regional perspective. And then more recently, I've gotten connected with state level and even local, more local or sub-regional air quality management districts. But in particular, I've had close partnerships with folks in Connecticut and in New York. And under NASA HACAST have built, as well as under a pilot study by NYSERDA, have built relationships at the Department of Health up in Albany, New York. And I also want to acknowledge Stephanie Shirley at TCEQ and many others that I've had the opportunity to at least be on monthly calls with, if not meet in person at meetings. Okay, so what is a stakeholder? So I did not feel like I had a go-to definition, so I did a Google search, and this was one of the figures that came up, and I felt like it seemed to work for the way I was thinking about it. So a stakeholder is an individual, group, or organization that is impacted by the outcome of a project, and importantly, they have an interest in the success of the project. And it took me a while to decide if I liked the little cartoon on the side or not, and at first the fact that it was growing out of what looks like a cell phone seemed like maybe that didn't work for me, and then I thought about all the time that I spend on phone calls with stakeholder partners, and actually I think there are a lot of relationships and collaborations that have in some sense built out of the phone or our virtual connectivity, so I decided I could go with it. I also really like that the leaves are different colors and sort of diversity, inclusion, that we learn and we grow when we have these diverse perspectives that different scientists and different stakeholders bring to projects. The thumbs up to me are like the checkpoints along the way, that as you're working on a project, you're checking in, is this working? Okay, yes it is, let's keep going. But also the watering can, that we need to be nurturing these relationships and these projects as they grow. And then of course the dialogue, there's communication all the way through. I also am not really sure at all if this is what the artist intended. This is my spin on this schematic that I found online. But I like the little, like, I don't even know what to call them, the little circle things and the pluses coming out. To me, that's the new ideas that are being generated as part of this project. Okay, I'll give up on my over-interpreting this schematic and move on to what I think is probably the core summary from the talk, again, from this Runnebaum paper that came out earlier this year, with this idea that credible science, if science is going to be used in applications, that has to be the core. But that there's other aspects. It's not just the science alone, but this sort of circle that we have dialogue, two ways, that we're building relationships, and we're making sure that we're taking that science and translating it into metrics that are usable by the stakeholders who are involved. Okay. So here is my attempt to give an example of a problem that has generated a lot of interest in the scientific air quality community, as well as with certain stakeholder groups. And that is, how do we go about attaining the National Ozone Air Quality Standard? And even beyond that, my sort of initial kind of jumping into all this was thinking about setting the standard when the health evidence which is a major part of this, keeps suggesting that that the level at which we say sort of it's okay to breathe pollution, that there really isn't a threshold, and that the health supports lower and lower values for this national ambient air quality standard for ozone. And so I started, and I should acknowledge, I'm pretty sure that this timeline kind of thing, and I'm thinking of it as a timeline, it's really on an ozone concentration timeline here, originated probably with my PhD advisor, and then I've adapted from there. And I think there's a version of it that ended up in a National Academy report that my PhD advisor, Daniel Jacob, was involved in. So I probably should have acknowledged that report here. But basically, the idea is that in the late 70s, there was the first ozone standard was set. I think before that, it was a total oxidant standard, but it was 120 ppb for a 1 hour average, was not to be exceeded. So it was a very extreme level of air pollution. And then as what's built into the Clean Air Act that the National Ambient Air Quality Standards kind of fall under is that this is a science-based standard, so there's a required review of the scientific criteria on which the standard is based periodically, which in practice is roughly every 5 years. In practice, I think it's sometimes, as you can see from the timeline here, a little bit longer than that. But basically, when that review happened in the mid-90s, the decision was to change the standard and change the formulation from a 1 hour average to an 8 hour average. And the way that actually works is that you're taking for every day, you're calculating your different 8 hour averages and you pick the highest. And in this case, it's the fourth highest 8 hour average that we look at, and that fourth highest averaged over 3 years cannot exceed 84 ppb as of 97. Then in 2008, again, this revision happens, and it's decided to tighten the standard further to 75 ppb, and then again in 2015, it was tightened to 70 ppb. And thresholds as low as 60 ppb were considered at that time in the discussion. And a major sort of point of contention or sticking point in setting the standard is that it has to be attainable. And attainable means it has to be under the control of US air quality management districts, their jurisdiction to control. And we, as I'll sort of get into in a little more detail in the coming slides, there's a component of ozone that is not anthropogenic, that is natural, and ozone's lifetime is long enough that can also be transported even around the globe. And so the question then arises, well, how much of the ozone that we're measuring is from US anthropogenic emissions versus other sources? And so this sort of everything else in this terminology is kind of background. And I'm going to go through in the next few slides some pretty specific definitions of background that have come to be used. But because we don't have like a nice isotopic way yet, at least, of separating where ozone is coming from, how much is from local sources versus, say, sources in Asia or elsewhere, or coming down from the stratosphere, we rely on models for those estimates of background. And typically what's done, or what had been done in these studies, is zeroing out US or North American anthropogenic emissions. And so from the way I've drawn things here, it looks like we have some cushion, as I'll call it, in between that background and where the standard is set. And that is, we can think of as this ozone that's kind of allowed to be produced from US ozone sources and still attain the standard. However, there's a whole body of literature that I am not incorporating in the schematic that suggests that there can be times when background goes much higher, particularly in high altitude locations like where we are, and even further up in the mountains, where particularly in springtime, you can have, for instance, stratospheric intrusions that make it into the lower troposphere, and if you're already at altitude, you're kind of tapping into those air masses. And the western US at high altitude is also potentially susceptible to pollution plumes coming in across the Pacific. We also could think about sources from Canada and Mexico. We also have natural sources of ozone, both external to the US and internal, so thinking about those precursors. And I probably should have gone on because I'll have a schematic that lays this out. But so the idea then is that from the schematic, lowering thresholds for the US ozone standard then implies that we're thinning this cushion from, in this graph, from the right side. And if, for instance, global emissions are rising, then we can potentially be thinning this from the left side too, and leaving much less room for attainment of the standard from US anthropogenic sources. And particularly in the kind of 2000s and even the beginning of the 2010s, as Asian emissions were climbing upward, then that was a real concern, that we're making all these efforts to control our own pollution, and then if global sources are rising, are we still gonna be not making much progress in terms of our air quality. So I thought on this kind of, I'm thinking of it as a timeline. I realize it's really an ozone concentration graph, but I guess if you focus on the red lines, it's a timeline. Sort of some of the milestones that I'll try to touch on in the talk today, where I was building my collaborative network with, in other words, meeting stakeholder partners and air quality managers, and more recently, health managers. And largely on background ozone, although the talk will get a little bit broader than that. So basically, I started my PhD in '98, and my PhD advisor included me in numerous meetings with air quality managers that, as I mentioned earlier, have really influenced kind of the direction of some of my science and also my career by creating opportunities through going to meetings, et cetera. And it's not just for the folks at EPA, but I also was able in my PhD to interact with folks at the Clean Air Task Force, the Northeast States for Coordinated Air Use Management. So one of the other things in terms of career was that I feel like early on I was exposed to folks working in air quality in other areas than academia, so what we might think of as alternative careers. And that was really neat to have that exposure. And also in air quality, you cross paths a lot with folks in consulting companies that are also doing research and publishing. Okay, so then in 2011, I was lucky enough to be one of 19 PIs selected to be on the NASA Air Quality Applied Sciences teams. And to me, this was a way to actually make it part of my official job to be having phone conversations and building collaborations with air quality managers. And so these were things that I enjoyed doing previously, and now it was like almost like I was getting credit for doing it, which was really kind of a neat project to have. And then again, I was lucky enough in 2016 to get onto the successor team to ACAS, which expands to health, and that there's, I think, 13 PIs on HACAST. And I was just at our 6th meeting with stakeholders, and actually the final one for HACAST in Pasadena 2 weeks ago. Okay, so we're going to jump into the ozone smog problem a little bit. I thought that it would be helpful to just get a sense of where we stand as of at least 2015, 2016, 2017 in terms of attainment of the ozone air quality standard. So the dark blue points on this graph are the places that are exceeding the 70 ppb or 0.07 ppm in these units threshold of that National Ambient Air Quality Standard. So we can see the Northeast Corridor around Lake Michigan, Houston, certainly the Central Valley, and LA are still having problems. What you can't tell from this graph is that all of the light blue points that are below, or not all of them, but many of them, are actually not that far away from the 70 ppb threshold, meaning that if we were to move to a tighter standard, the sort of places that would light up as non-attainment would expand spatially on this map. And there's a nice paper or perspectives piece in Science in 2015 from Owen Cooper at Noah Ezril that kind of shows how this would change for different threshold values. Okay, and then I just repeated sort of the definition of the formulation that I spoke through on the previous slide here. So it's a little bit complicated, that fourth highest of the 8-hour daily maximum value averaged over 3 years. Okay, so where does ozone come from? The ingredients are reactive carbon, nitrogen oxides, and sunlight. And the way that I tend to think about these sources is that we have our highly reactive VOCs, such as, for instance, isoprene that comes from vegetation and is very strongly sensitive to light and temperature, and nitrogen oxides. Those can react really quickly and on timescales of hours and build up high levels of ozone. So when we're having ozone alert days like today, by and large, it's this sort of rapid fueling of local and regional ozone production. And then we also have this, what I'm going to call here baseline, and I'll define this term in a second, ozone levels. And this is ozone that's kind of produced from longer-lived species. So I'm highlighting methane here because methane has a 10-year lifetime in the atmosphere, which means it's pretty well mixed. But when it reacts in the presence of NOx and sunlight, it also forms ozone, which contributes to this kind of global background ozone, or baseline upon which then these local to regional ozone pollution episodes can build. So one of the key things that I have learned is that it's really important to use the right lingo when you're talking with air quality managers. And we recently on a call had a snafu where we quickly got brought up to speed and learned some new lingo. But this is what I'm going to define here for ozone, is baseline ozone, which is measurable. And it's generally when people talk about background sites, or they really should probably be saying baseline sites, it's what we can measure at sites that are very remote, that have little influence from recent US anthropogenic emissions. So these are places, one that's often used in the background ozone literature is Trinidad Head on the coast of California, that is kind of receiving supposedly clean marine air, or potentially higher up, maybe pollution plumes coming in across the Pacific. Versus background ozone, which is entirely a model construct. And so this is basically ozone that would be present in the absence of anthropogenic emissions within the region or the country or the continent that you're considering. And so here I've kind of detailed out the different sources that are included, which I have on this slide. My sense is the current preferred definition for sort of EPA type applications is US background ozone, where we zero out anthropogenic emissions within the US. So that means that all of the sources that I've colored in blue here are part of that background. So lightning, stratosphere, intercontinental transport, global methane, natural source precursors to ozone, NOx and NMVOC, right, and fires, which especially out west can potentially be a big source. And actually, there's a bit of a controversy as to how much ozone fires do make, and the field campaigns last summer and this summer that are actually going on right now should be pretty exciting in terms of hopefully figuring out how much ozone fires do make. And I think it's probably complicated and depends on conditions, but it'll be interesting to see those papers coming out. Okay, so then we have a variation on this theme, which is North American background. And the reason why I bother introducing this, even though it's not really the current favorite definition, is because it was formerly known as policy relevant background. And because of that, that was what was used in a lot of the policy documents and also the research papers that were being cited in those policy documents up until several years ago. And so this is basically parallel to the US background, except that now we're zeroing out North American anthropogenic emissions. And then, of course, just a reminder that what we're actually measuring or modeling in a full simulation is the total ozone, which consists of whatever is the background plus whatever's produced locally and regionally within the region of interest. Okay, so this is an old figure from my PhD that I threw in just to make a couple points. And that is that the policy context, and also in some sense, therefore, the relatability of the science that's published changes as the National Ambient Air Quality Standard is revised. So what I'm showing you here is a plot where, for all of these clean air status and trends network sites, for June, July, August of 2001, I simply threw them all together, lined them up in order from lowest ozone measured value to highest ozone measured value. I took a simulation in the GeosChem chemistry transport model for the year 2001, where I then sampled at all of the sites and did the same thing. So the red is just the model lined up from lowest to highest. Now, a key caveat here is that that does not mean that this point corresponds to the location and timing of this point in the model. Okay, so that's an important caveat. But what I then do with the green points here is I have this other simulation that at that time was called policy-relevant background. Now it's North American background. But I zeroed out North American anthropogenic emissions and went and found, OK, in this simulation, what is the value of the background on the day that this ozone was simulated? And so one of the conclusions that we drew, and the major conclusion of this paper, is that on the highest observed, or highest at least modeled ozone days, the background is low. And so really, these peak events are being driven by US anthropogenic emissions. OK, and so that was when the standard was 84 ppb. And so if I kind of draw a line here for 84 ppb and look down, I see, OK, the background is probably less than half of at least the total simulated ozone. If I move forward some years now and move to a 70 ppb standard, the context is a little bit different. And now we see that, well, actually this model suggests the background could be over half of that ozone. And so all of a sudden, the major conclusion of this paper that, oh, the background doesn't matter on the high ozone days, well, now we're worried about high ozone days that are lower. They're 70 ppb instead of 84. And so maybe this importance of the background is, in a relative sense, increasing. And so this actually led to a fair bit of work trying to look at individual components of the background and kind of parse this apart. In this plot, I had lumped the whole US low elevation sites together. Maybe we want to actually start thinking more carefully about different regions. And so that sort of led to some additional work. And then again, this was only a single model. And so another thing that I was excited to do was look at this in a different model. And the questions are, how much confidence do we actually have in these estimates if they're really going to be used in a sort of more policy type of setting? OK, so just to, I think we've mentioned already this NASA Air Quality Applied Sciences team. But like I said, this was an exciting opportunity for me to partner with stakeholders and work more on these kinds of questions. And so this was a schematic that I pulled from the ACAST website that just shows that the goal of this team was to take Earth science resources, of course, with being a heavy emphasis on satellite data, and address air quality management needs. Of course, what I'm going to show you most of is actually on the modeling side today, because we can't directly observe background ozone. And so one of the things we did under this team was a collaborative project where, at this point now, my group is the AM3 model. So these are simulations from the GFDL AM3 model that I had set up to nudge to observed winds so that we could compare it directly in space and time with actual observations, and compare then with what GeoSchem, this is work by Lin Zhang from Daniel Jacobs' group, was showing. And what I'm showing you here is the fourth highest MDA8, so this daily maximum 8-hour average ozone concentration for the year 2006, although we only had the simulations from GeoSchem for March through August. So it's not actually the whole year, but we do pretty much have the high ozone season. The other point that you can't tell from this figure, I mean, you can already see that there's some spatial differences, there's some magnitude differences. I could probably talk forever about these differences, but basically, these are two simulations where we zeroed out North American anthropogenic emissions. What's also different here is the timing of when these fourth highest events are happening differs between the two models, where in the blob kind of centered over Colorado in AM3 was happening in spring, whereas the blob centered over New Mexico in the GeoSchem model was happening in the summertime. And it turned out that even though I somewhat naively went into this thinking, we're going to compare two models for background ozone, and since background ozone is largely transported and we're nudging these models to synoptic scale meteorology, they're not going to be that different. Well, I was pretty wrong, and in hindsight, pretty naive. And that's because, of course, they were treating these natural sources differently. In GeoSchem, that blob over New Mexico tended to be associated with ozone produced from lightning knocks. In the AM3 model, we think a fair bit of that blob over Colorado in springtime is actually stratospheric ozone. Both models have their warts. Both models have some strengths. And what I took away from this was actually we get a lot more by looking at multiple models where we can kind of pick the strengths of each of them. What I'm not showing you is we had done a whole bunch of evaluation, including with satellite data. But the conclusions from this were that there really were differences associated with how we were treating these natural sources. And those differences actually mattered more than horizontal resolution, because we also had a version of GeoSChem at the coarse resolution of AM3, and that looked a lot more like the fine res GeoSChem than the coarse res AM3. And one of the frustrating things is that there was a growing literature on background ozone, but as is typical and totally understandable, they were mostly academic studies, and everybody was kind of defining things slightly differently, but differently enough that it was really hard to compare across studies. People were running different meteorological years. And so another aspect of this was that with the coarse resolution AM3, we actually ran, I think, 2 decades worth of a simulation so that we could also look at the interannual variability in the background. And again, I'm not actually going to show results from that here. But one of the findings that actually was consistent across the models was we correlated the background ozone simulation with the total ozone simulation at each site where there were observations. I mean, we could have done this for the whole model, but for whatever reason for this figure, we just focused on where we had observations. And what you see is that the plot is showing the correlation coefficient R. And in the Western US, total ozone and background ozone actually correlate strongly in the model. So this suggests that those are the places where we might worry about high background contributing to high total ozone events. But for much of the lower elevation sites in the eastern US, that correlation was much weaker. There's also a lot of interesting differences across the models that I'm happy to talk about later if folks are interested. Okay, so the conclusion was that it's high altitude Western US where background ozone is really a concern in terms of potentially getting close or even exceeding that threshold that the National Ambient Air Quality Standard is setting. So this, all of sort of this interest in trying to come up with a more cohesive discussion of what do we know about background ozone and what can we say with confidence led Dan Jaffe at University of Washington to lead a review paper. It was really, we called it the Background Ozone Scientific Assessment. There were several scientists involved. There were also air quality managers involved, including Gail Tonneson here at Region 8 of EPA, and Tom Moore, who's also up in Fort Collins at Westar RAP. And so this is one of the figures from that paper that shows the observed total 4th highest ozone. So these are observations. This figure was made by Owen Cooper, actually, who was a co-author at NOAA Esrael. So lots of Colorado connections with this review paper. But so this is what's actually observed. And then on the bottom, what's showing is a newer version of the GFDL AM3 model that Mei-Yoon Lin at GFDL had run, where she zeroed out North American anthropogenic emissions. And the intent of this figure is to show that over much of the eastern US, the modeled background is much lower than the observed 4th highest NAB. But over the western US, there are times where the model is exceeding 60 ppb and getting up to near the standard or even at the standard of 70 ppb. Okay, but again, this is one value. It's your 4th highest. Sorry, she zeroed out US anthropogenic emissions. And so there's high uncertainty associated with this, again, being a single model and kind of picking out the 4th highest value in each grid cell. Okay, so coming back to sort of the theme of the talk in working with air quality managers, another really important point is trying as a scientist to understand the context in which our stakeholder partners are using that science. And one of the challenges is that context, as I've sort of alluded to, can change over time. But this is a slide that I really love from Terry Keating at US EPA, who put together this schematic of, imagine that where the red portion of the bar stops is just the total measured ozone. And this is just some hypothetical deconstruction into individual sources, but that the concern here is that total bar should be below the NAAQS, right? But you have some that's your state, you have some coming from upwind states, and on this portion of the slide, what's being shown is the different provisions under the Clean Air Act that particular portion of ozone is regulated under. And so this is sort of part of where this complexity comes from, is that different components of total ozone are actually regulated under different parts of the law. And so that's kind of interesting. From a scientific perspective, it's really exciting to think about, wanting to understand the different processes that contribute at any given space and time, and in particular that distinction between what's considered non-controllable ozone sources, or this part of the background, versus what's under the jurisdiction of US air quality managers. And so as Terry points out, we need to understand this breakdown on the days when exceedances are happening. And just to give an example, if you can show that your ozone is exceeded because there was a wildfire enhancing your ozone, then you can file under an exceptional event and get an exception if EPA approves it. These exceptional event documents are hundreds of pages and require a lot of work. And actually, I have an example later where an air quality manager, Michael Geigert from Connecticut, put one together and actually did get it approved. But it was, as he says, he spent a year, I mean, not exclusively working on that, but it took a long time to put that together. Okay, so the question that I've been interested in for a long time is how do background ozone components vary in space and time? I'm going to switch again back to the GS Chem model here. This is work where the simulations were done by a former postdoc, Lee Murray, who's now a professor at University of Rochester in New York, for ACAST, but actually we've ended up mining them quite a bit under this HACAST project as well. And so these are simulations from 2004 to 2012 with the old MERA meteorology. I have the details of some of the emissions listed. I don't expect you to read this table, but I just wanted to point out that we did, Lee did a whole slew of simulations where he conducted perturbations to try to isolate different components of the background, including the US background, the North American background, but also what's coming from soil nitrogen oxides, what's coming from fires, et cetera. And so basically what this allows us to do is to take my little schematic from before, and from those simulations, or in some cases by differencing pairs of simulations, we can get at many of these different components of the background, including what's coming from the US, which is not part of the background. And so an example of this is, and this is actually from under the ACAST project, I had a summer intern, Melissa Cito, who worked on this. But we were looking for this heat wave that I actually talked about yesterday in 2012. This is looking at one particular day. And just an example that we can take, what we're looking at here is the ratio, so the fraction of the total ozone that the model attributes to US anthropogenic emissions. We picked on poor Tennessee here and zeroed out emissions within Tennessee, but it makes the point that in the eastern US, it's really a regional problem. A single state can't solve it by itself. And that's why we have regional air quality programs. And then this is what was coming in from Canada and Mexico. I should note the color scale change from this plot to over here. And this is the US background. One of the things that was interesting is while we know in general sort of the paradigm in the eastern US in summer is that the ozone episodes are largely US NOx emissions combining with biogenic NMVOC emissions for regional scale episodes, we actually found that there were portions of the country, at least in the model, where there were biogenic NMVOC combining with soil NOx and increasing what we might think of as natural background. So Jean Guo, my former student, kind of took these simulations and tried to really synthesize across them. And this is just a summary plot for the Midwest, looking from 2004 to 2012. The red bars are the average on the top 10 observed ozone days, again with this MDA metric in summertime. And actually what she's done here is to average all the sites within an EPA region. She's also sampling the model at those sites and then averaging the same way. So there's a fair bit of data processing going on here. And what we're looking at then is the MDA ozone value for the USB simulation. So this is the US background. What's coming from US anthropogenic emissions, what's coming in from the BVOC. This is the portion attributed by the models to intercontinental transport and methane, and then what's coming from Canada and Mexico. And what we took away from this is that it's regionally produced ozone that's leading to the most enhanced top 10 days relative to this blue bar, which is the average of all summer days. You'll notice that the background is a little bit enhanced as well. However, it's not because of intercontinental transport or that baseline ozone coming from methane or from transport in from Canada and Mexico, on average at least. Now, if we switch and look at the mountain, like EPA Region 8, which is what we're in here, you notice that it's a little bit less of an enhancement from anthropogenic emissions. There's some BVOC. But again, we conclude that it's not really the transported component that's leading to these enhancements. However, there is definitely a role for background on these highest days on average, according to this model. And I should, again, emphasize that this is a 2 by 2.5 degree model. So we're not exactly resolving the front range and the higher peaks behind it particularly well. Okay, so moving on in time to working on this NASA Health and Air Quality Applied Sciences team. The mission for this team is connecting NASA data and tools with health and air quality stakeholders. And personally, this has been an opportunity for me to connect more with these multi-jurisdictional organizations, which are multi-state, with a couple health organizations and working more with individual states. And so my core project for this, which is with my co-I, Pat Kinney, who, when we proposed the project, he was at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health. He has since moved on to Boston University. But we're still working closely on the project together. And our goal was to try to inform health accountability analyses and air quality planning. And we were bringing together satellite data. We had CMAQ simulations that were conducted by our partners up at New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. We, of course, have lots of ground-based measurements. We've also ended up bringing in Discovery Q aircraft data into this analysis, although we hadn't initially proposed it. And then the hospital data is obtained in partnership through the New York State Department of Health. And so my student, Xiaomeng Jin, has been working on understanding uncertainties in how we go from satellite AOD to what we actually care about from a health perspective, which is the fine particulate matter concentrations on the ground, with a focus on the Northeast in particular and New York State specifically. And she's also been looking at different available data sets for exposure over New York State, which then link in with our colleagues. Mike Key is a graduate student at Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia, and he's actually been linking those exposures with hospital admissions to actually do more of an epidemiological study where you look at the exposure response functions or kind of derive them. So the question that Xiaomeng has been looking at that's in a paper in Press is how much uncertainty is there in health impact analyses just from choosing a different exposure data set. And so she found 7 publicly available data sets, 4 of which include remote sensing in the Dalhousie approach. This is out of Randall Martin's group, where they're actually using a geophysical approach and using model information to go from column AOD to surface PM 2.5. As opposed to, for instance, Emory, this is Yang Lu's group, which they're actually using machine learning techniques and building statistical and land use regression models to estimate PM, and they're doing this actually at a much finer scale. And then this is the CDC Wonder data set, which is also publicly available. And then we have the CMAQ model by itself. We have the fused ground-based monitors with the CMAQ model, and then this is just a inverse distance weighted approach to smear out the air quality monitors. And although these spatial patterns look quite different, and Xiaomeng in this paper is evaluating with a couple available independent data sets and looking not just at day-to-day, but also seasonal cycles, et cetera, they all show declines from 2002 to 2012. And so that's encouraging because we kind of think we know that PM has declined over this period. But then the question is, how much difference does this make when we run it through what's called the health impact analysis, where working with Pat Kinney, Xiaomeng just kind of pulled an off-the-shelf exposure response function that's used in the global burden of disease and calculated the mortality burden so that we can look at how the premature mortality associated with exposure to PM 2.5 over New York State has changed over time. So this is going from 2002 to 2012. The different data sets are the different color. And overall, there's about an estimated 50% or so decline in premature mortality due to this decrease in PM 2.5 over New York State. One of the interesting findings, though, is that if you look at the difference you get in the health responses by using these 7 different data sets, it's actually much smaller, about only a third of the uncertainty in the exposure response function itself. And another thing that I've learned from working with health colleagues is they don't really care whether it's a geophysical satellite approach or a machine learning approach. They just want the best, finest resolution data set they can get their hands on, ideally at neighborhood scales, because they sometimes do have health information available at those scales. Okay, so I think in the interest of time, am going to skip over this part and just mention that another aspect of what Xiaomeng has been working on is trying to think about ozone formation chemistry. And the question that we would get from air quality managers is, in my city, is NOx control alone enough to reduce ozone, or should I also be thinking about VOC controls? And this comes out because the chemistry is fairly nonlinear. It's been well established really since the 80s. That you have these different ozone formation regimes. But the cool thing is that we have two proxies for one for VOC and one for NOx that we can view from space. And so this is exciting. And in the US, where we have a lot of observations, we have opportunities to kind of validate this and then potentially take it global. And so this is a lot of technical details that I won't go through, but Xiaomeng has been doing that and is continuing to do it with new and new products that are coming available. But this is an example just showing that for the Eastern US and Europe, we've been moving into more NOx-sensitive conditions, which is exactly what we'd expect as we reduce NOx under the policies that have been implemented to control ozone under the Clean Air Act. In China, there's some regions where it's becoming more NOx-sensitive, but there's also regions where it's going the other way. In other words, NOx emissions have been increasing and changing the formation chemistry. And the reason why we care is that if you're in this NOx-saturated or VOC-limited regime, if you reduce NOx, you actually increase your ozone. Okay, and so you sort of have to, if you want to get past that, you have to sort of think about different control strategies than if you're already in a NOx-limited regime. So one of the things that we were doing under the HACAS team is trying to think about how is that information actually useful for these air quality managers. And so we set up one of these collaborative projects where we actually, so one of the things that motivated this is that it turned out that Connecticut actually took some of Xiaomeng's figures and was using it in their state implementation plan that they submit to EPA for approval that they're on the right track for attaining the air quality standard. And so we kind of realized, like, this is really exciting. It's also a little bit scary. And so maybe we should think about if there are people that are using some of these satellite data for actual sort of policy process, we should provide a technical guidance document and try to explain what some of the pitfalls are. And also, if a different agency wants to do it for their region, how would you go about doing that? And so that was the motivation here. And we had not just Xiaomeng's case study, but a couple others. And then we, as part of this process, had a different agency who would test out the document. And then once we felt like it had been vetted a bit or a lot, we would make it available, which they now, 3 of these documents now are on our websites. And so this is Xiaomeng's slide just showing that she developed this methodology, she wrote a technical guidance document, somebody tested it out in the Georgia Environmental Protection Division. And then what was pretty cool is once it was out there, actually South Coast Air Quality Management District asked for more information about it. So at least one agency was expressing interest. And one of the concerns, of course, as an advisor to graduate students is you're writing a technical guidance document. That's not peer-reviewed literature. On the other hand, it's nice to be able to put it on your CV as something that you did. And so what we figured out was that with Columbia Academic Commons, we could have a permanent home so that the links from the NASA website should live forever, and also put a DOI with it. And so that these are the 3 documents. And this is the one that was written by one of our stakeholder partners on an exceptional event for wildfires. Okay, I realize I do want to leave time for questions, so I'm just going to kind of skip through this, but say that we're doing some similar things for haze. And one of the things that is important, of course, with communication is not just what I'm doing now, which is talking one way, but actually listening. And so we opened up this project with listening sessions with 5 stakeholder partner agencies. And then one of our products was actually just figuring out what are we going to work on, what are questions that are of interest to multiple stakeholders, and can we prioritize our limited time in the year that we have for this project to those. And so we've developed a document that we hope will be useful beyond the team in the sense that it's sort of laying out these questions that air quality managers have regarding haze that we're not able to address all of them. And one of the other things is just this point about managing expectations, because satellite instruments don't directly observe what is needed for haze, which is what's the anthropogenic component, what's the natural component, and what's the speciation. And so, but we do get nice information from satellites about dust, about fires, about some of the precursor gases and trends over time in those precursor gases, as well as total aerosol optical depth. And so part of this is also the communication of what the tools we have can actually deliver and what they can't. Okay, and so these are some examples from that I'm going to skip through, but with summer interns and somebody writing a thesis who's taking Xiaomeng's formaldehyde and NO2 work and thinking about the role of drought. And so I just wanted to mention that because it's kind of a fun new area for us that we're starting to think about. And so stay tuned, Jake will be finishing his thesis next spring. So to close out, this was a slide that Kevin Cromar, who's at NYU and works with a lot of stakeholder partners in the air quality community, showed. And I really liked it because he said, we tend to focus in all these meetings on our successes. And when you talk to people who are interested in getting involved in stakeholder partnerships, he said, I realized it's also important to remind people that not everything succeeds, and that when things don't succeed, it's not always because your science isn't the right science, but there's a lot of competing factors going on in the partner agencies that might affect their ability to really participate and take your science and translate it into something that Kevin has labeled as a sustainable adoption. One of the things we also talked about at the meeting, though, is that sometimes things do actually go the other way, where if you have a successful product, sometimes you do entrain other stakeholders in. And so, but nevertheless, it is important to recognize that there are projects that start out and don't succeed. And then the second sort of closing thoughts, this I found when I was Googling about what stakeholder partnerships were. And I liked this as well, just that obviously it's important to communicate well, and that kind of, I think of it as learning the lingo in part, being open and honest, managing expectations. And then this one I sort of rewrote because I think from our perspective as scientists, it's really working to understand the policy and regulatory framework of your stakeholders. And for me, I've just come to accept that I'm never going to 100% understand all of the intricacies and the complexities of the environment that these people work in on a daily basis, but it's important at least to try to understand so that you can make your science or to translate it into the metrics that are most useful. So the policy context is often complex, can change rapidly, but this gives opportunities for science to weigh in and shape directions. And then to sum up, my favorite schematic of the talk, I just wanted to point out, especially to all the early career scientists, that I think there are tons of opportunities on the horizon. We have so many new data sets that have the potential to weigh in on air quality and health that really need expertise to do that translation. We have geostationary satellites that are going up that we should have almost hourly, or at least multiple times per day, information about some key air pollutants. And of course, many of you are working already on big data analytics, and as our computational power expands and our ability to observe, I put just a low-cost sensor here as an example, there's a need to integrate all of this information and work to translate it to the scales and metrics that are relevant, and making sure that when you're working with folks, of course, that there's regular two-way communication so you're building trust and reliability so that people are more able to adopt your credible science. Okay, I'm going to stop there, sorry. Hopefully there's a little time for questions.